Hi everyone, my name is Mike Zusman, and I think you probably already know Alex Sotirov over here. And so to kind of give a brief introduction to what we're going to talk about today, the last year has been a rough one for SSL in general. You know, it started with Dan Kaminsky and his big DNS flaw, and that kind of put SSL as kind of a feasible target on the map and brought it under far more scrutiny. So since over the past year, you know, there's been a lot of attacks against DVSSL and certificate authorities and crypto attacks, web app attacks against CAs. And a lot of this hasn't really touched extended validation or kind of the next generation of SSL certificates thought to, you know, solve all the problems of poor validation that we've been dealing with, you know, for the past 13, 14 years. So essentially, EVSSL, as we all know, is seen as a stronger method of assurance of site security, right? But the big problem is if SSL underneath EV is broken, how can we actually trust EVSSL going forward? And the answer is we can't, because a rogue non-EV certificate can be used to do man-in-the-middle attacks against EV sites. So just to talk a little bit more about the organization of our presentation today, we're going to go over the state of the SSL PKI in general. We're going to see how the stage is set for EV to come in and save the day. And then we're going to go into the different methods we have for actually breaking EV, which you see here. We actually have 4 different attacks: mixed content attacks, same origin attacks, which have actually been documented and discussed previously. Our new attack, which we call SSL rebinding, EVSSL cache poisoning, and finally we're going to sum things up with a couple of solutions and some ways to fix this mess and make the internet more secure going forward. So I'm going to throw it over to Alex. He's going to take you through the state of the PKI.
All right, so it's been a while since SSL was first introduced, and we've had a pretty long history of experience with using SSL. We've also had a pretty long history of SSL problems and people trying to solve these problems through technical means, organizational means, and so on. So for those of you who were around in 1999 and were using SSL certificates in 1999, you probably remember that it used to be very, very hard to get an SSL certificate. It was actually quite an ordeal. There was only a limited number of certificate authorities back then that were supported by the major browsers. And the certificates that those certificate authorities sold were quite expensive. I actually had to go to the Internet Archive and find an old cached copy of, I believe, VeriSign's site to get a price quote for how much an SSL certificate cost back in 1999. And the price that I got from that old website was $895. And I believe this was for the regular SSL, which to get you had to fax some documents, show that you're a legitimate company, and then it took, I think, 5 days for them to deliver the certificate to you. And they used to deliver it by mail. You would actually receive like a mail package with the certificate in it. If you paid the higher price, so $895 was the base package. If you paid the higher price, I don't remember how much higher it was. I think it was like maybe $1,000, slightly above $1,000. Then you got the faster service, which was basically the same, but they shipped the certificate with the faster mail, and you got it in I think overnight instead of having to wait a couple of days. So this is what SSL was back then. Was it secure? Perhaps. At that point, phishing attacks were not really that big. Man-in-the-middle attacks were not really that big. We didn't have the untrusted wireless networks everywhere. So we cannot for sure say that SSL was secure then, but it is not secure now. But what we can say is that today, SSL is definitely not as secure as it is supposed to be. So one of the reasons for this is the proliferation of the certificate authorities. So in 2009, we have 136 trusted root certificates. I counted them in the latest version of Firefox. And all of those root certificates map to certificate authorities, which are typically commercial companies that have a set of policies for how they issue these certificates. Now, because there's a lot of competition between these companies, over the years we have seen a significant reduction in the amount of validation and the strictness of the validation that the certificate authorities would do before they issue a certificate. So for example, there is a number of certificate authorities today which will give you certificates for free over email issued by a completely automated system. The only thing that you have to prove as a proof of identity is that you have an email address within the domain that you're trying to buy a certificate for. Or actually, since these certificates are free, you're not even buying it. So you don't even have to put a credit card in. There's very, very little validation. And of course, we all know that email is the most secure communication medium ever invented. So certainly these certificates are very, very hard to get by evil attackers and malicious parties. And that was a joke. They're actually not hard to get at all. So over the last, I think it started maybe 2 years ago, we started to see this ramp up in attacks on certificate authorities. And especially over the last year, we saw a number of really devastating attacks on certificate authorities. Some of them were really, really basic, really stupid. They required absolutely no ingenuity on the part of the attackers at all.
Easy, man.
For example, the Komodo problem. I was going to use the stronger word, but I'm taking it easy. The problem that Komodo had last year with one of their resellers, who apparently, for some reason, their system that they used for their resellers, for that particular reseller, the system had completely turned the validation off. So you could go to the reseller site, you could type in the domain that you want to get a certificate for, and it would be issued and emailed to you. And there was absolutely no validation that you even had an email address at that domain. And through this, I believe people were able to get, like the person who discovered this and reported it was able to get a certificate for Mozilla.com. We've also seen a number of other attacks. There's been a lot of web application flaws in certificate authority systems. And actually, Mike is doing a talk at DEF CON in a couple of days when he will talk about these in a little bit more detail. But over the last year, we've seen multiple flaws like that. Another problem that Mike discovered and demonstrated last year in Vegas was the problem with the email addresses that certificate authorities use to email you the certificate. These email addresses, they usually have a list of email addresses that they accept. And one of these email addresses is SSL Certificates at the domain. So Mike was able to register SSL certificates at live.com. Live.com offers free webmail, so you can register any address you want, and this address was not taken. So if you can register this address, you can go to a certificate authority and you can say, hey, give me a certificate for live.com. You can even say, hey, give me a certificate for login.live.com. Which is a domain where the credentials go when you log in to the live.com service. And there are many other sites that are vulnerable to the exact same flaw. Finally, if you're here for the other SSL talks, You probably heard about the null byte attack, which both Maxi Marling-Spike and Dan Kaminsky talked about yesterday. So this attack allowed you to inject a null byte into the domain name in a certificate. And there were a handful of certificate authorities that did not check for these null bytes. So if you could get one of these certificates, you could get a certificate for any domain you wanted without any validation that you're authorized to have a certificate for that domain. And finally, perhaps the most technically sophisticated attacks, even though they're just as effective as the more simpler attacks, were the crypto attacks that we saw over the last year. One of these was the MD5 collision attack, where a team that I was a part of used a cluster of 200 PlayStation 3s to mount a large-scale cryptographic attack on the Rapid SSL Certificate Authority. And we were able to get not just a certificate for a website, we were able to get a certificate for a second-level certificate authority, which gave us the ability to issue arbitrary numbers of certificates for arbitrary domains. Also of concern is the SHA-1 algorithm that is the replacement of MD5. We have seen increasingly stronger attacks against the SHA-1 algorithm, and it is definitely a possibility that the SHA-1 algorithm will also be broken, and the same type of collision attacks will be possible against it. And this is quite an issue because at this point we don't really have a very good replacement for SHA-1. So this shows that there are a number of ways in which certificate authorities fail. And this is not just an isolated, a single isolated vulnerability that somebody found and it got fixed. We've seen many of these vulnerabilities constantly coming out. And I'm pretty sure that over the next months and years, we will see more attacks of this nature. So why is this? Why are we seeing these certificate authorities flaws? Well, the problem is that there's nobody really taking care of the security of the certificate authorities. Now, back in the day when the idea of SSL and the certificate authorities was first introduced, people believed that the browser vendors who ultimately decide which certificate authorities are trusted and which certificate authorities should not be trusted, the browser vendors would be the ones to act as gatekeepers and ensure that all of their users can rely on certificate authorities that are, in fact, trustworthy. But the last 10 years have shown that this is not the case. Despite multiple flaws in multiple certificate authorities, we have never seen a browser remove a certificate authority from their trusted list. Part of this is because the browser vendors don't want to be in the business of deciding who is trustworthy and who is not. They don't want to interfere with the business of the certificate authorities, especially, I believe, the larger vendors who have a large part of the, a large section of the market. If they start acting as a gatekeeper, then the certificate authorities could perhaps legitimately complain that, hey, we're trying to get into this business, but we're not being let in by this company that, perhaps they're a monopoly, and they're trying to keep us out. So this is one of the reasons why the browsers have not been very proactive in ensuring the security of the certificate authorities. What they've tried to do is they've tried to outsource these decisions to a company called WebTrust. Now, WebTrust is an auditor, which is supposed to go to the certificate authorities and verify that they're following good practices, that they're secure, and that they're okay. Many browser vendors rely on this WebTrust certification to let certificate authorities into the browsers. So, for example, if you're a certificate authority, maybe you're a little startup company, and you want to start a certificate authority, what you have to do is go to WebTrust, get certified, and then you go to Mozilla and you say, hey, here's my certification, add me to the browser. And Mozilla would do that. Now, the problem with Web Trust is that it is actually run by accountants, not security professionals. Like, Web Trust is not a security company in the same sense that we put into security. For example, the certification doesn't say anything about web application pen testing or pen testing of the certificate authorities' networks and internal computer systems. There's, of course, a lot of verifying policies, but as you all know, just because you have good policies doesn't mean that your network or your web applications are actually secure. The other problem is that the crypto standards, which SSL heavily relies on, are not really inspected by Web Trust to the degree that they should be. This is why we still had MD5 certificate authorities in 2009, or late 2008 to 2009, when we've known that MD5, or the cryptographic community has known that MD5 has been broken since 2005. So 4 years later, having this broken algorithm with attacks that were continuously improving, we still had certificate authorities that used it. And this is because the Web Trust certification did not say anything about you should not use MD5. Also, Dan yesterday in his talk talked about the certificate authority that used a certificate signed with MD2, which was still present in browsers up until recently. And through Dan's efforts, finally the certificate was replaced. But MD2 is even worse than MD5, and there are even more practical attacks on it that were possible. So the fact that it was still present there shows the problems with relying on Web Trust to do the certification. It's just because they're not cryptography experts. So where are the cryptography experts or the web application security experts looking at the certificate authorities? Well, they don't exist. Or meaning maybe they do and they're right here on stage, but we're just doing this, for fun. We're not doing this in any official capacity. So there's no organized formal method for securing these certificate authorities. And finally, the final problem with Web Trust is that they actually get paid by the certificate authorities. So if they don't certify certificate authorities, then they would not get paid. So it is in their interest to certify more and more certificate authorities, and they get paid yearly. I believe that this is a very flawed model. Any kind of certification of certificate authorities should be paid by the browser vendors or the individual end users through some kind of channel. So the people who do this certification should represent the interests of the end users rather than the certificate authorities. Otherwise, you would end up with a situation which we have with PCI right now, which I'm sure you've heard about all the problems with that. So now I'll give it up to Mike to talk about extended validation and how this is supposed to make things better.
All right, thank you, Alex. So EV to the rescue, right? Again, this is the new version of SSL certificates that's going to save the day. So EV certificates have stronger validation, and they make it easier for a user to trust a site. So how does that happen? Well, the stronger validation essentially refers to the validation process when an organization requests a certificate. So we know we go into OpenSSL or maybe IIS or web browser, we generate a CSR, certificate signing request. And if we go to one of the certificate authorities with less stringent validation practices, we send off the CSR, we give them the right email address, click on a link, they issue our certificate. Well, that doesn't fly with EV. Extended validation requires a much more stringent offline validation of the organization requesting the certificate. So you need to actually prove the legal identity of the organization requesting the certificate and show that they're authorized to administer the domain for the certificate they're requesting. So it's not something you can easily, achieved by parameter tampering a website or some other, basic web app attack. There's a big process involved. Additionally, EVSSL costs a lot more. You can get your $9.95 domain validated certificate rather easily, but EV certificates, I've seen them cost anywhere from $800 to, $2,000. But again, that's something that, is determined by each certificate authority. But fortunately, there's an organization that's setting some requirements for EV, and they're also trying to set more stringent requirements for DV as well. But the CAB Forum, the Certificate Authority and Browser Forum, is essentially, a nonprofit group comprised of the browser vendors and various certificate authorities, and they're working together to kind of come up with meet on a common ground so that everybody's on the same page and everybody's doing the same thing. And they've set some pretty strict requirements for EV. Obviously, there's the extensive legal identity validation, and then we get into some more technical aspects of SSL and PKI, such as, hey, don't use MD5, it's broken, or other weak cryptographic algorithms, and they're setting goals. Don't use these after 2010. Additionally, making things mandatory, like support for certificate revocation lists, online certificate or online security certificate protocol, online status of certificate protocols, OCSP. OSCP. So essentially, they're out trying to set the standard for everyone to follow so that everybody can do the right thing, and we don't fall into the hole that we've fallen into with domain-validated SSLs. And of course, to the layperson or to the users who are visiting sites that are using EVSSL, they get the warm and fuzzy feeling of seeing the green glow and all the identity information that's contained in the certificate. So the goals of EV, like we said, it's about identity. So identifying the legal entity that controls the website is very important. Obviously, I can get a domain that might look like PayPal, but I shouldn't be able to prove that I actually am PayPal unless I have all the things that PayPal has, all their legal documentation, tax ID numbers, whatever the actual process is of going through to get to assert the identity. Number two, again, provide stronger validation than the email domain validation. I like to say you can't really secure the internet with the internet. So all the, all the kind of technical controls in place with domain validation they all need to be secured with SSL themselves and other security controls, and they're just not there. So, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem there. The standard goal of SSL in general, enable encrypted communication between two parties so that nobody can sniff their bytes going across the wire. But then one of the main sticking points of EV, one of the main goals is to combat phishing. So it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of vetting the identity of the requester, but we need to make sure that www.paypal.com.blah.blah.blah.evil.com is obviously not PayPal to a user who, isn't a security expert. So obviously the goal of EV is to get that green badge there so the user knows, okay, this is a trust indicator, this is PayPal, I can easily and quickly identify them, and now I can trust them based on that identification. So what's funny is that those are the goals of EV as laid out by the CAB Forum. We can read about the goals on the CAB Forum website. But then if you start looking at the certificate authorities themselves and looking at some of their marketing material, we see that the goals of EV can quickly get lost in the push to sell EV. Like I said, EVSSL costs a lot more than DVSSL. So, hey, if we can sell more EV, obviously that's good for the bottom line. Obviously keeping profit margins and all the business aspects of that in line as well. But what you see is that it goes from technical people, browser forum, browser vendors saying we need a solution to combat phishing and to make it very easy for a user to identify the legal party behind a website. We see that the CAs are kind of pushing it different depending on who they're talking to. So here we have one quote from some Komodo documentation that says this is a great opportunity for e-commerce providers to capitalize on consumer fears by displaying trust indicators. So put something on your website that users will trust and they'll buy more from you. Doesn't matter really what's going on underneath. Are they more secure? Are they not more secure? They feel more secure, so they'll enter their credit card number. Another challenge for EVSSL is, well, if users don't know what the green bar means, well, then it's kind of worthless, isn't it? So Thought actually commissioned a third party to conduct a study. And they put together a survey of, I don't know, a couple hundred, 300, 400 users of varying degrees of experience on the internet to try to gauge whether or not EVSSL and the green badge actually meant anything to them. But the interesting thing is that before they actually surveyed them on a number of different, they showed them screenshots. Hey, this site has a green badge, this site doesn't. Which one do you trust more? Well, they explained to them that the presence of EVSSL and the green badge means that the site is more secure. So obviously, what are the users going to think? So again, on the one hand, the goals of EV is to sort of be this trusted indicator of identity. The way the CAs are sometimes marketing it is something that means the site is secure. And obviously there's a lot more that goes into website security and secure e-commerce than just SSL. Okay. So we're going to talk about some flawed assumptions that undermine EV going forward. So initially when EV came about, again, it was to solve the identity problem. But underneath that, it was assumed that the current SSL PKI and DVSSL, well, was trustworthy. I mean, maybe they knew it had problems here and there, but it was still deemed trustworthy. Now we know that regular SSL is pretty darn broken on a whole number of different levels that Alex went over early on in the presentation. And what we've shown with our recent research is that because the underlying DVSSL and SSL is broken in general, that EV security is undermined as well. So this is the EV reality. Again, we go back to our 4 goals. Number 1, identifying the legal entity that controls a website, that can be undermined. Number 2, providing stronger validation than the email, domain validation to actually get the EV certificate and have a website show the green badge, that can be undermined as well. And enabling encrypted communications such that, well, I know if I see the green badge, nobody can see my data except for Bank of America or except for PayPal. That's not true either. So essentially what we're going to show is that because of these flaws with DV and SSL PKI as it's existed, we can achieve equality between a domain-validated SSL certificate and an EV SSL certificate. So obviously attackers, as recent research has shown, it can be very easy for attackers to get their hands on domain-validated certificates for which they're not authorized for, and then they can subsequently use that to undermine the security of the green badge and an EVSSL protected session. So with that, we go into breaking EV certificates. Okay, yep. So again, some new assumptions now that we've proven that crypto attacks, web application security flaws, implementation-specific bugs in crypto libraries like OpenSSL and Crypto API, we've shown that it is possible for attackers to get domain-validated certificates or non-EV certificates for a specific domain. So again, rogue cert created using MD5, owning the email server for a target domain, exploiting the CA validation system. Early on, Alex mentioned the Komodo incident, where a Komodo reseller simply had validation turned off. So there was actually a problem. If you go and look at some of the Komodo resellers that are out there on the internet now, and you actually order some certificates through them and see how their authorization emails come out, you can see that the actual control of the authorization flow, of the authorization process, is completely within the hands of the Komodo partner, not controlled by Komodo themselves. So what you'll actually see is that the authorization email for this one CA I was looking at, the authorization email came out of an SMTP server at a shared hosting provider, as opposed to an SMTP server run by Komodo, hopefully in a secure, hardened, professionally maintained network. So what this kind of shows us is that these problems can be far more than just implementation-specific bugs in a website, but they can be just architecturally flawed and just bad process that can lead to these sorts of attacks. Another assumption, well, once the user gets, or once the attacker gets the non-EV certificate, for these attacks to take place, obviously the attacker has to have a foothold as a man in the middle. And there are a number of proven ways of becoming man in the middle: ARP spoofing, insecure wireless networks, and of course last summer we learned how prolific DNS spoofing can become, or can be with an insecure DNS implementation. So again, just to highlight our assumptions, attacker has the non-EV certificate and he's also man in the middle. So once that's done, once those assumptions are met, we have a number of different attack vectors. We're going to talk about mixed content on EV websites. So you go to your bank and login.bank.com uses an EV SSL certificate, so you get the green badge. You feel warm and fuzzy. But then if you look at the HTML, obviously they're pulling in scripts and images, and they could be coming from just other hosts on the bank network. They could possibly be coming from third parties. Google Analytics is a common one we see. It's protected with SSL, but it's not protected with DV. And essentially what we have is a situation where the user sees the green badge, they feel secure, okay, my session is protected with this new great version of SSL, but really it's only that one connection that was protected with EV SSL. All that other content that's being pulled into the page could possibly be coming from third parties, or just coming over connections protected by DV SSL certificates, which obviously could be vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. But the problem there is that even though there are these DV certs in the mix, they still see the green glow of EV. Another flaw, the same origin JavaScript injection flaw. This is one that was originally covered by Adam Barth and Colin Jackson in their finer-grained origins paper. And in that, they actually talk about a victim being man in the middle and connecting to the DV SSL certificate first. So they go straight to a DV connection, and at that point, they get some JavaScript injected. And on the next connection, they're connected straight to the EV certificate. They get the green glow, but in reality, there's some JavaScript running in their browser that the browser sees as coming from the same origin that's protected by the EV certificate. And we're going to talk about SSL rebinding, which is similar in concept to the same origin problem, but it's actually the opposite, where we start downgrading users. So the user's connecting to the EV SSL protected site through the man in the middle. The man in the middle lets them connect to the EV SSL certificate, get the green glow. But then on these subsequent connections coming out of the browser, he downgrades them to DV. And then he redirects them, lets them connect back through to EV again. Green glow is either restored, or maybe it never goes away, and the user has no idea what's going on underneath. And that's what we call SSL rebinding. But then some even nastier attacks that can happen are SSL cache poisoning, where, going back to talking about the mixed content, well, what if DV protected content, not only does it just get spoofed one time, but it actually, the attacker poisons the browser cache with that malicious content. So now what happens is you get into a situation where a victim could be on an insecure network. They get their cache poisoned when they're not even going to an EV-SSL protected website. They go home, they go to work, they go to a secure network, they go to their EV protected site, and the entire EV session is compromised because of this poisoned content in their cache, yet they still see the green glow. So again, we're really kind of exploiting the trust of this green glow. The users are going to see it, they're going to feel more secure, they're going to feel like nothing is wrong, but in reality, it's a false sense of security. So again, just to talk a little bit more about each of these in detail, if we talk about mixed content policy, the browsers are going to allow EV sites to load JavaScript, CSS content, images, what have you, from non-EV servers. PayPal does this. They have EVSSL on their www.paypal.com domain where they're accepting usernames and passwords, but then they load all their JavaScript from https www.paypalobjects.com. And additionally, every site that uses Google Analytics does the same thing. So how does an attack like that actually unfold? So the user requests the EVSSL protected domain. They get their green bar, they're happy, but the page includes this script from the non-EV protected domain. The non-EV protected domain is what gets manned in the middle. The green glow stays there, doesn't go away. And again, this is happening with the non-EV, the DV certificate that's signed by a trusted authority. That gets poisoned with some malicious JavaScript. And once that's loaded up in the browser, the green glow is there, but the attacker's code is running. And at that point, you can do anything you can do in a cross-site scripting attack. Modify the page, capture keystrokes, intercept form submissions. And again, all the while the user sees the green glow and feels happy and secure. But an interesting problem is, what if the site that we're actually man in the middling also uses an EVSSL certificate? So both PayPal.com and PayPalObjects.com have EVSSL. Well, it doesn't matter because the attack still works. And this is because the browsers don't discern between EV and DVSSL at the moment. They're trusted equally. The only difference is in the Chrome showing the green or not showing the green. So the same origin policy attack.
I got that.
You got it?
All right, so the second attack that we're going to talk about is the same origin policy attack. And this is actually one of the things that prompted us to start doing this research. It was first described in a paper by Adam Barth and Colin Jackson back in 2008. What they described is, or the flaw that they noticed was that the browser, which typically distinguishes between sites that are loaded from SSL domains and sites that are loaded without SSL, the browser does not distinguish between EV and normal SSL sites. So, for example, if you have PayPal and you open PayPal with HTTP plain text in one browser window, and then you open PayPal with HTTPS and with SSL in another browser window, the browser will prevent the plain text site, the plain text window, from injecting any kind of content such as JavaScript or accessing any of the contents of the other window, because it knows that the SSL site should be trusted more than the non-SSL site. So it tries to prevent any cross-contamination. However, it does not distinguish between EV and regular SSL. So if the attacker can open the same domain once with EV and once without, then the regular SSL page can inject JavaScript into the EV page. And it can also read all of its contents. It can read the password field, username field, browser credentials, cookies. And here's how this looks as an actual attack. So in the first step, the user would go to paypal.com. The attacker will do a man-in-the-middle attack and will return some HTML that opens a pop-up in the browser. And we're assuming that the pop-up blocking is disabled, but there could be other ways to do this attack too. This is just an example. So we return some HTML that the attacker controls and that opens a pop-up. Then we return the contents of that pop-up, and that pop-up will refresh the original site. When the original site is refreshed, we're going to let the connection go to the real server. So now the browser will see the extended validation certificate and it will show the green bar. But we still have the pop-up that is loaded with the attacker's contents. And that pop-up is loaded from the same paypal.com domain as the other window that has the green bar. So all we have to do is inject JavaScript from the pop-up into the main PayPal page and then close the pop-up. And at this point, the attacker would have full control over everything that happens on the PayPal website, even though the browser will show the green bar. So this is the second attack. The next one, Mike?
Sure.
The next one is even better.
So SSL rebinding. Again, the browsers don't care if the SSL certificate from one connection to the other is EV or is DV, which is kind of, I don't know, to me it's counterintuitive. I mean, if we look at how we handle plain text HTTP versus HTTPS, if somebody tries to downgrade you or even just redirect a post from HTTPS to HTTP, the browser is going to throw a warning and it's going to make a lot of noise. It doesn't do the same thing for EV and DV SSL. But the funny thing is that even though you have the green in front of you, and that's what the user's looking at, and that's what's making them feel safe and willing to enter their data, it's really the next connection that is where they're going to get compromised. So essentially in SSL rebinding, we're switching from non-EV to EV, and we're doing the same sort of JavaScript injection that we did on the previous slide. Or when we're switching from EV to non-EV, we're stealing session cookies and form data on the request, but then we're doing an HTTP 302 for a GET, or an HTTP 307 for a POST. So the HTTP 307 response is kind of interesting because the different browsers respond differently when they see it. Internet Explorer 7 would actually just follow the 307. It would replay the post, send the data, not warn the user. There's actually a slight bug there where for the SSL rebinding to actually function, we need to redirect the form post to the same exact URL. When IE7 saw this going on, it's redirecting to the same exact URL, it wouldn't send the post data. It would still send the request, but the actual form data wouldn't be there. So we fixed that just by tacking on a hashtag at the end of the URL. So obviously just an implementation specific bug there. Firefox 3.5 on the other hand, when you throw out a 307 response, it'll actually prompt the user to say, hey, we're trying to be redirected here. Press OK to let us go and send the data again. However, you can also do it without, so in the Firefox example, you don't need to rely on the 307 to redirect a post. You can actually just send back a 200 OK with a specially formed HTML page and with JavaScript in there that automatically causes the browser to refresh, replay the post. And on the second request, the man in the middle lets the connection go all the way through to the EV certificate. So on the first connection, on the first post, The man in the middle terminates with his DV SSL certificate. He captures the data. He then redirects the browser, lets him connect back again, this time all the way through to the real web server with the EV SSL certificate. The green glow is restored. The user probably doesn't notice anything, and their transaction goes through. So that's SSL rebinding. We're constantly switching from serving out our own DV SSL certificate to letting the victim connect back through us and terminate SSL with the real server. So just to kind of step through that attack, obviously the user requests https www.paypal.com. We man in the middle the connection, capture any cookies, and return HTML that tells the browser to immediately refresh itself. And in this HTTP response, we actually send it a connection close header, just to make sure the browser closes a TCP connection and launches a new one, opens up a new connection, and now the proxy knows, okay, this is a new connection. It's keeping track of how many connections this particular client is making. We're going to let this next one go through. Then the browser requests the same URL again, and this time we let it go through. Browser shows the green bar, and we just kind of go through this cycle, repeating steps 1 through 3 for each new SSL connection. Kind of a different mindset that we need to have here. You know, typically when you're talking about man in the middling somebody, you want to get all of the data. Well, you can't really do that here because then you lose the green glow. So we really you need to come up with a sort of method of, well, okay, I'm going to man in the middle this connection, but I'm going to let this one go through. And there are a number of different techniques we talked about in the paper that this can be done. For example, it might be possible, or it is possible, it's kind of difficult, but to hold a number of connections open with the browser such that the browser can only make one additional connection. So if the man in the middle is holding open 10 connections and the maximum number of connections the browser can make is 11, the man in the middle knows that, okay, it's only going to be making one connection, so I can intercept every one and redirect him and let him go through. However, if we don't do that, if we just try to man in the middle every connection coming out of the browser, the browser will get stuck in a loop. So the main problem that you need to work around is how can you kind of maintain state of all these different TCP connections. Some of them you can see the plain text data. Okay, you know what HTTP request this is. But when the browser replays that request over EVSSL, the man in the middle just sees encrypted bytes going by. So the solution we came up with was actually pretty straightforward and very effective, and that's just to keep count of every connection the client makes and every man in the middle every other connection. It's simple, it's effective. In reality, if you're man in the middling an authenticated banking session, you really just need to man in the middle one request and get that actual the user session cookie. You don't really need to see everything going through. Once you have the session cookie, you can then go make requests on the back end and impersonate the user. So again, just this idea of we're counting every connection that the user makes, and every other connection we're going to actually terminate SSL with the DV cert. And with that, we'll go into our first demo. And we'll just make sure we've got internet. And of course, we don't. No, I didn't.
Oh.
All right.
Yeah, so apparently there's no network cable here, so
Yeah.
I have to use the wireless network, which is not quite working right now.
Do you think you have one?
All right, everybody think happy thoughts and maybe the internet will come back. Or maybe somebody in one of the other talks broke it and it's gone. No more internet. We'll have to get new jobs.
All right. What about the secured network? Yeah.
Do you know the password and all that? Yeah, we tested this in the hotel room with a LAN, and that's why it's not working.
Here you go. Capital A, capital. There we go. Good
Yay.
deal. Thanks for your assistance.
Let's hope nobody is man in the middling the black hat wireless, because then we might have a problem.
All right. All right.
All right.
All right.
Well,
I think I'm going to pull the plug on this one.
We can show the demo after this if anybody wants to stick around to see it. We just have to get the internet to work. That's the problem with trying to demo man in the middle on real internet sites. You actually have to have the internet. You can't just run everything on an isolated VM. So I'm sure we'll get it. We'll get it working after this. We had it working in the hotel room upstairs.
All right.
It's more fun to man in the middle real ones. Okay, so let's move on to the next attack. The next attack is what we call SSL cache poisoning. Now, cache poisoning has been known for a long time. It's a very classic attack. The browser has a cache, so if the attacker can get malicious content cached, then at a later point when the user visits the same website, they'll see the malicious content getting loaded from the cache instead of the real website content. Now, how does that play with EV? Well, what we found out is that it is possible to cache malicious content that comes from a regular SSL site with a certificate that the attacker got in some, a rogue SSL certificate that the attacker acquired somehow fraudulently. And then the attacker can cache content using that certificate. And when the user opens up the same site with a real EV-SSL certificate at a later point, perhaps when the man-in-the-middle attack is no longer going on, the browser will still load the malicious content from the cache, and it will still display the green glow. So here are the steps of the attack. So the user will request google.com, and this happens on an insecure wireless network. Maybe it's a hotel network or a Starbucks, airport. So the user goes to Google with just plain text. The attacker can inject a hidden iframe into the Google page because it is a plain text page. There's no SSL. That hidden iframe will load PayPalObjects.com, and then it'll load some JavaScript from it. That PayPal Objects connection will go over SSL with a non-EV certificate, a regular SSL certificate, which the attacker had fraudulently acquired. So the attacker will return some content that has headers that tell the browser this content never expires, cache it for as long as possible, and that'll be it. Now, because the iframe is hidden, the user will never notice that anything happened. For them, it'll just look like they went to Google, they got the search results, everything was cool. Now, the user goes back home and plugs into their secured corporate network or their home network, which they trust, and they know that there's no man in the middle going on. And now the user goes to PayPal over this good, secure connection. Well, what the browser will do is it'll load PayPal, and then it'll load that JavaScript that we cached earlier. And it'll still show the green glow, but now the attacker-supplied JavaScript will execute in the PayPal website. And this is a very, very powerful attack because it allows the attacker to do a man-in-the-middle in one place, such as an airport network, where users might not want to do online banking. They're more security conscious, they'll only do online banking from home. But through the cache poisoning, it doesn't matter. The attacker can poison the cache at one place and then reuse that cached content on a secure network. So that's a very powerful attack. And for this, we actually have a little demo that we can kind of make it work without the internet. It's not the full one, but we prepared a little snapshot that should show you at least a little bit.
And this is actually it. So this is PayPal.com. Obviously, we see the green glow of VVSSL. We've got the identity information. But if we look at the title, we see that the title has been altered. And just to further prove that there's script executing in there, we can JavaScript alert the username and password. So essentially what happened here, like Alex said, the user viewed a plain text HTML page, HTTP, like Google, did a simple Google search on an insecure wireless network. Then they go home, that's where they feel safe, they know that's a trusted network. That's when they go to log into PayPal, but it's pulling this poison content out of the cache, and the attacker's code still executes. So the impact of the attacks. Well, we tried to show you the SSL rebinding, which would have proven and shown you how just because the EV-SSL shows the legal identity of the website as being one organization, in reality, there could be an anonymous man in the middle who's actually in control over that content. We've shown how providing stronger validation through the EV validation process really doesn't do much because it's only as strong as the weakest link, which in this case is the email domain validation for domain validated SSL certificates. And again, the SSL rebinding would show that the sanctity of the encrypted communication going back and forth really isn't there. You think you're talking to an organization, you think your data is protected, but in reality, the man in the middle can sniff the data coming out of the browser. Want to talk about point 4?
Oh, yeah. So the only thing that EV still gives us is some protection from phishing attacks with URLs like that, which is still good. So we're not claiming that EV is completely useless. In fact, the goal of this talk is to make EV better and to make it live up to its promise. So let's go quickly over how we can fix it, how we can fix these problems. Now, we've heard people say that EV was not designed to do anything other than fixing phishing. So as long as phishing is fixed, then EV is good. But if the attacker can do easy man in the middle, which all of these attacks on SSL has demonstrated, then they don't need to do phishing. They can just sit there and let the user go to the real website and just sniff their credentials. So this is a real problem that we need to fix. How do we fix it? We cannot really make non-EV certificates trustworthy again easily. There are people thinking about ways to do that, but I haven't heard any good solutions yet. What we need is a solution that separates the untrustworthy regular SSL from the EV, which would hopefully be better and be not vulnerable to a lot of these normal SSL attacks. And to do this, we need to fix the 4 different attacks that we outlined. So mixed content policy, this can be fixed by having the browser not allow the mixing of EV and regular SSL content. And Opera actually tried to do that when they first introduced support for EV, but they were forced to back off because the other browsers would not do it. And sites would appear broken in Opera and not broken in other sites. And users didn't like that. So we need a concentrated effort from all vendors working together to adopt this policy of disallowed mixed content. The second thing that we need to fix is the same origin policy. This one is actually pretty easy. Now, Jackson and Barth in their paper suggested replacing HTTPS with HTTP EV and treating that as a separate origin for websites. This would work, but there's no real need to expose this to the user by having a different URL scheme. It would be just as easy to just have an internal flag in the same origin data that distinguishes between EV and non-EV sites.
Sure.
Then,
SSL rebinding, this is also a rather simple one to fix. And it's not that we, essentially we can't allow multiple certificates for a particular domain during one browser session. This does introduce some deployment problems. For example, how do you upgrade certs on a server when there are connections already existing? It introduces complexity when you're talking about load balanced environments and content delivery systems that are probably using multiple SSL certs. But the better solution is not to allow switching, or not to bind any given session to one specific SSL cert, but to bind it to a class of SSL cert. So that if the session started off using EVSSL, well then it needs to only use EVSSL certificates for the remainder of the session. It shouldn't allow a downgrade to DV. For cache poisoning, fixing the mixed content policy and the same origin policy with SSL rebinding is not enough. We also need to discard cached content from non-EV sites when going to an EV site. So if the browser is going to an EV protected site and it pulls some content from the cache, but it sees that that content was originally served over DV, we need to get rid of that. So, in conclusion, the state of SSL PKI, much like our attempt to show you some demos, is dismal. EV certificates will prevent basic phishing attacks, but fail against man-in-the-middle attacks. What we need to see, and I think we will see with organizations like the CAB Forum, is a focused effort from the certificate authorities and the browser vendors, but especially the browser vendors to fix these issues. I only think we're going to have more problems going forward. We need to scale in the event that EVSSL one day also can't be trusted. So, all right. That's our presentation. Thanks for listening. And we're here for any questions.